My granddaddy was a railroad man. When I was young, he took me by the hand, dragged me to the station at the break of dawn. Said, boy, I got to show you something before it's gone. She was blue as silver, she was right on time. We rode the Texas Eagle on that Mopac line.
My name is Jim Adams, and I got involved because I felt sorry for two kids. One of them was Dave Kroc, and the other one was George Redmond. The two teenage kids were boys that had been hanging around my house chasing trains. We went to Paducah and various places like that to catch pictures of steam locomotives. And then they also spent a lot of time down in the boneyard at the Illinois Central, where they had the engines stored pending hauling off to be scrapped. And when they started hauling those engines off to be scrapped, these kids were very depressed, and you might say they were crying in their coats. I really wasn't much interested in a locomotive that was just sitting, dead, but I got to thinking, well, okay, maybe we ought to have a locomotive at Centralia. And I knew that Wayne Johnson, the president of the Illinois Central, had said a number of times that he would never give anybody a locomotive because as soon as the new wore off, they let them become an eyesore, and he didn't want anything that belonged to Illinois Central becoming an eyesore. After talking to several people that I knew, officials and so forth, I approached him about giving us 90 days to raise the cash to buy a locomotive at scrap price. And he granted that wish, and later when it looked like we were going to make it, he gave us a 30-day extension on that. And then right along towards the end of that 30-day extension, he was in town on business. Now, I was busy that day, so I didn't get to see him, but Leo Jonas, an attorney here, and Ernie Dolan, a retired engineer, had joined in the effort to get a locomotive, and they met him when he came to town, and he wanted to know how we were getting along, and they told him that we were doing pretty good on the money raising. Well, he said, I'm going to give you a locomotive. But he gave us the locomotive with the condition that we have a trust fund that would raise at least $350 a year so the locomotive could be painted. Well, of course, that was then. $350 wouldn't go to first base now, but anyway, we raised the trust fund. We figured we needed $12,000. So instead of going downtown and knocking on the doors of all the businesses, we started a campaign to get 1,000 people to give us $12. And Willie Joy at the Sentinel printed us up some nice receipt books with a picture of the engine and so forth. And we started out, and really it went over pretty good, but of course there were organizations and there were businesses and what have you that got involved and gave us considerably more than the $12. At one point our campaign kind of faltered, and then the word got out that the Veterans Club had voted to give us $500, and when that word got out, well, the money started pouring in, and that put us over the top. So Mr. Johnson told Ernie to go down and Leo to go down and pick out an engine, and they went down and picked out this 2500, which is one of the very few engines left. They've been shipping them out of town, and people ask, since the 2500 was the first locomotive remodeled of that series that was remodeled at Paducah, how come Paducah didn't get it instead of us? And we said, well, because it was here. delivered the locomotive to us one Labor Day weekend. They delivered the locomotive to us on Saturday morning. And also they delivered a pile of rail and ties and stuff which were being loaned to us to move the engine. So Saturday we made up 3 panels of track, 2 rail lengths long, with the ties box anchored so they couldn't slide on the rail. And they brought this locomotive in on what had been an old coach track. So we had to break that rail and connect to it and lay a track back into Broadway. We then made plans on how to move it. And Centralia being an oil field town, there were a lot of heavy-duty tractors with winches on them and winch trucks and so forth. And we had, oh gosh, I'm sure I'll leave out somebody, but we had Karchmer and Philo Bridges, who had all kind of equipment. In fact, his cat was the one that moved it. George White Salvage. George, there was a rumor that there was a brick tunnel under one of the streets there, and everybody wanted to know what would happen when this locomotive caved that tunnel in. And I said, well, what do you think George White's hanging around for? Now, that locomotive was designed to go around a 28-degree curve, which is a fairly sharp curve, but it's still more space than we had there. So what we had to do was seesaw the engine. We came back and we pulled it clear up onto the sidewalk on the south side of Broadway, and then scooted the track over and pulled it up as far as, well, we were hanging over this coach track, which was as far as we could go. And then, in order to gain time, we got a hold of the tender. The locomotive was setting so, and we got a hold of the tender and pulled it around like this, so that when we came back, it was headed into Broadway better. And that scooting that tender like we did probably saved us 2 seesaws, which were time consuming. We had 3 of those panels made up, and the locomotive in moving it would take up more than 1 panel. It occupied part of 2, so as soon as they cleared the one in back, why, they'd unbolt it, and 1 winch truck running forward and 1 winch truck running backward would pick it up, take it up, and then the operator on the cat would slack off his winch line and pull the cat forward, and we'd move it in and set it down in front of the engine, bolt it up, and start pulling again. Then after we got the locomotive ready to head west, there's a automobile parts train on the Southern that comes through here around 5 o'clock in the evening, and they would not give us permission to cross ahead of that, because if anything happened and we blocked that parts train, the lack of parts would shut down the automobile assembly plant in St. Louis. So we had to pad our foot until that train went, and then we started west, and we got it as far as Pullen, which at that time was state right-of-way, and our permit to be on the state right-of-way was only good for the daylight hours. So that meant that we had to go from Pullen all the way into the park in 1 day. So from Thursday night until Saturday morning, the train sat there at Pullen, and Bo West, who the former Burlington employee, was our night watchman, and he gave us some hilarious tales about hearing tires squall and cars stopped out there. There's a locomotive sitting in the middle of the street. Yeah, we started at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning, made our first move about 5, and we had it on the foundation in the park about 10 minutes ahead of 5 that evening. And I don't think I was ever more tired in my life. Moved it without any incident, and this is all done with volunteer help. The railroad loaned us equipment. The only thing that we had to buy from the railroad was the rail and ties that the locomotive was sitting on out there, and even the concrete. The company donated everything except we paid for the cement that went into the mix.